Hi, how is everyone? Good morning. So this is part 3 of our look, really our introduction to the ethics, to lay the foundation for our discussion of friendship in books 8 and 9. All right, so we first just looked at a kind of overview of this text, how it's laid out, and the point of view from which Aristotle writes, and some of the discussion about the style of his writing. Then we looked at Aristotle's concept of human nature, and the role of development and of reason, and ultimately it seems of friendship in relationship to happiness. The telos of human nature, very simple, is happiness, right? And ultimately our question is going to be, what is the role of friendship in that? So today we're going to look and focus on a discussion of Aristotle's concept of happiness. And really, we've already touched on it. If the nature of a human being is a rational nature, and its characteristic functioning is rational functioning, and our goal is happiness, to achieve our goal, we have to function or live excellently in our use of reason or in accord with reason in order to achieve our goal. So a happy life or achieving happiness is going to consist of living rationally in some way. Okay, so happiness. We know we want it, and the question is, what is it? Right? So if ethics is the science of happiness, this is important, and I'll move myself over here, that its data of facts to be observed are not found under a microscope or at the end of a telescope. They're not exactly seen directly with the naked eye, right? If we want to find evidence of what happiness is, we have to look at how human beings actually live and their opinions regarding their own understanding of happiness. Because, of course, when they say, you say to a person, what is happiness? You're by definition getting their point of view, their opinion in relationship to how they're actually living, not some kind of generic, broader understanding. Okay, so what is the problem for the science of ethics? It's all good and well to have various opinions, either spoken or observed, so opinions about people's conception of happiness, or simply you observe their life, and through observing their actions, you see what constitutes for them the goal and purpose of their life. But there's a problem with ethics as a science, or rather a complication that, of course, is one of the great challenges of ethics and morality. The natural sciences, like physics, biology, or chemistry, are all exclusively concerned with observing and describing the physical or empirical facts of the world, the world of the senses. Ethics, however, is a science that's not merely descriptive, but normative. What do we mean by normative? A normative science is not merely determined to explain what people do or what happens in the world, but rather what they should do or what they ought to do. So one of the great mysteries, kind of Rubik's Cube of ethics, is how do you move from observable facts about what people think is happiness or good and bad, and how they actually live. How do you move from those facts to what a human being ought to do, right? Therefore, ethics has to move from descriptions of what people actually do to what they should do. And what's important about Aristotle's assertions about happiness is that he thinks, in light of the fact that you are a human being, a being with a certain type of particular nature, the description of happiness I'm giving you is what you should do as a human being. So before Aristotle gives us anything of his own opinion or own conclusions about happiness, he starts from, say, canvassing his own society. In a sense, what he's doing is acting something like a sociologist and making a kind of demographic survey or taking an opinion poll based on what he sees about what people seem to think happiness is. So he doesn't start from his own assertions. He starts from what people think happiness is to them. And this is book 1, chapter 5, And it's very often called the three lives, because what he's going to describe here is three lives and three ways of living that seem to people in society on the whole to be the three dominant conceptions of what happiness is. He says, let us speak from the point of view where we digress, for on the basis of the lives they lead, the many and the crudest seem to suppose, not unreasonably, that the good and happiness are pleasure, and they cherish the life of enjoyment. For the especially prominent ways of life are three: the one just mentioned, that means the life of pleasure, the political life, and third, the contemplative life. So notice what he says, for the especially prominent ways of life are three. So he seems to be making a claim that, yes, on one hand, every individual, because of our natural diversity and our diversity of natures and our diversity of circumstances, every individual has a slightly shaded, different understanding of what happiness is to them. But he makes a basic claim that there are three dominant, broad opinions that society or all societies tend to hold about what happiness is. And this is important because when you look at these three, it will turn out to be the life of pleasure, the life of honor, or the life of contemplation. These three claims to happiness seem to inhabit any and all societies. They are not unique to, for example, the Greek world. And, let's be clear, the value of this text is not that it's a Greek text. The value of it in the sense that we want to understand simply what the Greeks thought to understand them historically. The point is, what he's talking about here has direct relevance to us. And so notice what he says here. He says the many and the crudest believe that happiness is pleasure. And it will become clear that the pleasure he's talking about are the pleasures of the body. We've already established pretty clearly that for Aristotle, happiness is going to be connected with pleasure. But a human being consists of a body and a soul, and there are pleasures of body and the pleasures of the soul. And then within the soul itself is divided into subcomponents, and there are different pleasures from those different motivational sources. So the many and the crudest. Aristotle, throughout all of his writings dealing with moral and political philosophy, makes a distinction, kind of large, a cleaving of society into the few and the many, and there are different valences of this. And sometimes he could be talking about the few who are wealthy and the many who are not, or he could be talking about the few who are rational and the few who are not. And he speaks of the many and the crudest. And what does it mean to be crude? It means to be vulgar. It means to be, to some extent, ignorant. It means to be uneducated. It's the antonym of being refined. And how does one get refined? One gets refined through various types of education, both moral and intellectual. So the many who don't have a high degree of moral and intellectual cultivation think naturally that pleasure is the highest good and therefore synonymous with happiness. He says, now, in choosing a life of fatted cattle, the many appear altogether slavish, but they attain a hearing at this tribunal to determine happiness, because many people in positions of authority experience passions like those of Sardar Palace. Now this is interesting. He says the people who see life as pleasure or happiness as bodily pleasure, they're like fatted cattle. So think about that. An animal that does not use their reason, an animal that is simply led by its nose of physical well-being and creature comforts. Fatted, they're fat, they're docile, they're passive, and he describes them as slavish. So what are these people? They're slaves to their passions. They're slaves to their bodily desires. Now, he's just spoke about the many and the unrefined. He seems to be talking about the majority of people in ancient Greece who lacked, refined education. However, the example he gives is of a Mesopotamian king by the name of Sardar Palace. Now, who is Sardar Palace? He was a great king, an Assyrian king, who famously was a decadent, indulgent king. He did not rule well over his people, and he used all of his powers simply to satisfy his own personal desires, particularly desire for bodily pleasure. And the famous story is that there was an enemy at the gate with their army ready to attack, and instead of meeting the challenge of the army, he actually set his entire kingdom on fire, because essentially he was too lazy to be bothered with protecting his own people, because his singular concern was the desires of the body, and he was, of course, a slave to his own passions. Now, it's interesting he chooses the example of a king, which means seeing the life of pleasure as happiness is not simply confined to the many who are uneducated. He says, the refined and active, on the other hand, choose honor, for this is pretty much the end of the political life. So the second life he calls the political life, describing the profession where honor is going to be attained, but really this is the life of honor. What is honor? It's a desire for recognition. And in the ancient Greek society, politics, still like today, was one of, but even more so in ancient Greece, was the dominant stage of human life. Public life was where one could get the ultimate form of notoriety, the power that could bring about notoriety. Politics was the domain where ambitious people went. Right? So you think about it today, we have musicians and Hollywood celebrities, and of course, Washington, D.C., the federal government is described as Hollywood for ugly people. Right? It's the place where one can get power and recognition and attention from others. But for Aristotle, political life was the central stage to be seen. And when you desire to be honored, you desire to be recognized by, in political life, is it a few people or many people? You want to be recognized as a politician by as many people as possible for your power, for your standing, for your status, so on and so forth. Right? You need only think of a musician who puts on a concert in a football stadium with 70,000 fans there. Now, no doubt they love their music and they're there for the sake of the enjoyment of playing their music. But if you really loved your music, I suppose you could go in your garage with nobody around and play it and be totally satisfied. You think of someone like Lady Gaga and her little monsters, everybody there like her, to follow her and pay attention. The thrill that she's getting is not just from playing her music, but being recognized by her fans, right? And think about, what is a fan? A fan is an abbreviation or a nickname for a fanatic, right? Someone who is obsessed. And you'd be hard pressed to disabuse someone of saying that, what musicians and celebrities love is they love people who are obsessed with them, following them, right? And this is I'm setting this all up because this is going to end up being very important. But it appears to be more superficial than what is being sought. But what is the it? Appears to be more superficial than what is being sought. Now the it is the life of honor. The thing being sought is happiness. What is he claiming here? That the life of honor seems to be more superficial than what true happiness for a human being really is. So he's already put down, you could say, the life of pleasure and the life of honor, right, as not consistent with a full understanding of happiness. Then the question is, why is that? He says, for honor seems to reside more in those who bestow it than in those who receive it. And we divine, we think, we believe, that the good is something of one's own and a thing not easily taken away. It's a really interesting assertion here. Aristotle is determined to craft an account of happiness that is, as much as is possible, the result of our own wherewithal, our own actions, and our own achievements, and is as least possible dependent on chance or fortune or fate. And dependence on others, right? The life of honor depends on lots of people honoring you, right? And to be dependent on them is for your own happiness to be dependent on others. And he wants us to depend primarily on ourselves as much as is possible, not entirely, but as much as is possible on ourselves. So think for a second about politicians and modern musicians who have big stadium tours and things like that, right? I mean, one day they're popular and they're sky high and they have adulation, and the next day the society has moved on. They are no longer the flavor of the week, and nobody could bother to pay attention to them anymore, right? You see great examples of this desire for recognition. I think perhaps one of the best, even better than in some ways Donald Trump or Barack Obama, is Bill Clinton. Whenever you see Bill Clinton give a public speech or just speak in any context publicly, you can tell he just relishes the attention, and it seems to like flow through his blood, and he thrives off of that, almost a kind of drug he gets from people paying attention to him, and he has a very strong connection with his audience, which is one of the things, interestingly, that even his political opponents were always incredibly impressed by. But then it gets more interesting. Oh, so there's one other aspect here, which is not only should happiness not be easily taken away, but it should be the result of your own achievement. And when someone's giving you honor, it's actually someone else who's doing the work, not you. You're just receiving it. So happiness is really going to be found in deeds that you do, in many cases, for other people. What are we going to see in friendship? Friendship is going to be about not just receiving things from friends, but from doing them. But he will get even more critical now of honor. He says, further, people seem to pursue honor so that they may be convinced that they themselves are good. At any rate, they seek to be honored by the prudent. Many issues raised here. People seek to pursue honor so that they may be convinced that they themselves are good. Now, wait a second. If I need to convince myself that I'm good, it means I'm not sure whether I'm actually good, right? Aristotle is attributing a motivation as to why people seek the life of honor. They seem to be seeking it because they want confirmation of their own worth, their own status, their own value as a human being from other people. Why? Because it's not clear that they value themselves by themselves terribly highly. Right? This is going to come back in Book 9. This concern here is really important. Because he's saying, I mean, someone who seeks this kind of recognition, I think we'd call a narcissist. A narcissist. And the person who seems to be the most egotistical or narcissistic, demanding of the attention of others, it turns out, from even Aristotle's point of view, and I think we can relate to this, that these people are insecure in a fundamental way about their own well-being. It even suggests that they lack good character, and the way they conceal that is to seek out the high opinion of other people who perhaps don't know everything about them, which is politicians, musicians. We only know the good stuff, right? We all sit there in great veneration because what we get from media, just in their day as in ours, is a crafted image, a kind of perfect image which makes us yearn to be like them, and we adulate them. Now, look what he said about politicians. He said politicians, we might use this word, they're corrupt. Their souls are corrupt. They need to be convinced by others that they're good because they're not good. And how are they going to do it? They're going to present an appearance to others so that the others will give the best reaction possible, and they will conceal from them their flaws and imperfections. It doesn't sound like friendship if you think about it. Because if you think friendship would involve a high degree of openness and an awareness by your friend of your own flaws. And then he says, but we seek to be honored by the prudent. Right? This raises another question. who do we want to be honored by? Do we want to be honored and recognized by just anybody? Of course, that's impossible. You can't be appreciated by everybody. Does it matter to be recognized by 1 million people? It's not nothing. But what matters more, 1 million people or the 5 most important people in your life? Right? It would seem that ultimately we don't want to be honored by anybody, but by people whose opinion we actually respect. Right? The prudent, which is the wise. And hopefully we're lucky enough to have wise people whose judgment we respect, and therefore we accept that they are willing to judge us. Now, honor and recognition are really important here, because this is an acknowledgement that our friends, let me put it this way, our lives happen on a stage, public and private. We act. There's a model being spelled out here. We act, and then we get rewarded or punished, praised or blamed for our actions. Were they just? Were they unjust? Were they great? Were they base? And so on and so forth. And our identity and our connectedness with other people is going to be crafted by our concern for their opinion of us. We've talked about thumos. Thumos is the social component of the soul that makes us concerned for the opinions of others, because it's the thing that makes us desire honor and recognition. He says, we seek to be honored by the prudent among those to whom they are known and for their virtue. It is clear then that in the case of these people, at least virtue is superior. So what do we want to be known for? Not just anything. We want to be known for the superiority of our virtue. The superiority of our virtue. And what is important about the political life and being honored? That we're being honored for virtues of the soul. In the life of pleasure, nobody's going to recognize you for indulging in bodily pleasures. And the virtues to be had are virtues of the body rather than virtues of the soul. Aristotle continues, saying, and perhaps someone might in fact suppose that virtue is to a greater degree the end of the political life. Yet it too appears to be rather incomplete. So this is interesting. He does acknowledge virtue is involved in the political life. And obviously, virtuous activity is his definition of happiness. But he says it's incomplete. So that would lead us to the conclusion that the virtues involved in the political life are themselves incomplete. Themselves incomplete. Now, what does incomplete mean? It means when something's incomplete, it is lacking self-sufficiency, it's not whole, it hasn't fulfilled the telos. Hasn't fulfilled the telos. He goes on to say, third is the contemplative life, about which we will make an investigation in what will follow. Too bad. Not going to learn anything about the contemplative life here. Now notice, he gives you the life of pleasure, he gives you the life of honors, the life of politics, and he gives you some analysis about them. He's already let you know they are not sufficient for human happiness. They may be involved, they may be part of the substructure, but they're not the capstone, they're the culmination of it. Is that culmination the contemplative life? Well, I don't know, because he doesn't tell us anything about it. And he says he'll give you this investigation in what will follow. Well, it turns out we're not going to see anything about the contemplative life until Book 10 of the Politics. And what about money? Can't money buy happiness? Notice, these are the 3 lives he discusses. He doesn't talk about the life of business, commerce, trade, making money, right? Notice what he says here. The money-making life is characterized by a certain constraint, and it is clear that wealth is not the good being sought. Wealth is not synonymous with happiness. Oh, Aristotle is such a prude. We can buy happiness, can't we? He says, for it is a useful thing, and for the sake of something else. Remember his opening discussion of the text in his understanding of means and ends. Ends are superior to means because means are simply the tools you use to attain your ends. What's the problem with the life of making money? What does it result in? You make money. Well, what's the problem with that? Money is not a good in and of itself. Rather, it's simply a means for purchasing the thing that you really want, or the thing that will get you what you really want, right? So this is why the life of making money is not even on the table here. Now, does Aristotle then countenance the idea that true happiness is someone who's impoverished on the street, lacking in all their resources? Absolutely not. And he's going to actually spell out a very important function, a basic function that we're all going to be able to recognize for wealth. When you have basic resources of life, they're never enough to make you happy. But if you don't have them, the first thing you need is those basic resources. So you see the conundrum there. So here we have the three lives spelled out. The life of study, the political life, and the life of pleasure. And let's be clear, these are the three candidates for happiness. And in essence, he's already given us his answer. The first two are problematic, and the top one, the third one, the life of study, he hasn't bothered mentioning. There is a specific object of each. The life of pleasure seeks bodily pleasure. It's probably connected with the life of money making, because if you want to have a life of pleasure, you need the wealth to be able to purchase the pleasures. The political life, again, honor and public recognition. And the life of study is built around the object of desires is knowledge, understanding, or wisdom. So you can see here the way in which these three lives are actually built around the three parts of the soul, right? We talked about logos, thumos, and epithumia. Logos being reason, which desires knowledge. Thumos, which desires recognition. And epithumia, which desires the basic, is appetite and desires the basic needs of survival, the physical needs of the body, both needs and also desires, right? So now here's the key thing. Each of these lives is going to be driven by a primary motivational source. So if I live the life of pleasure, it means I'm primarily driven by my psychological appetites. If I live the life of honors, it means I'm primarily driven by thumos. If I live the life of contemplation, it means I'm primarily driven by my reason. Now, of course, in the real world, everybody is a mixture of these three. And you could say there's like an EQ system of up and down scales that everyone has a little bit more of this and a little less of that. Anyone who's living the life of pleasure isn't lacking in some concern for honor or desire to know. It just turns out that is their dominant impulse. How do you know what someone's dominant impulse is? It's very simple. We're all going to die. We only have so much time to do what we need to do on the planet. Look at what people actually do and how they prioritize their time. That is how you know what they want and what they're really about. Okay, so now let's move more specifically to Aristotle's account of happiness. And we should say it's a rather technical explanation of happiness that is not always perfectly satisfying. But let's make some general claims, starting from these broad claims throughout Book 1 that he makes. He says, in effect, that the telos of human life is happiness, right? The goal of human life is happiness. The highest good, just another way for speaking about it, is happiness. Happiness is a good. It's a thing we think we want. And it turns out to be the good, which is to say the highest good. And therefore it is the human good, because only human beings can be happy, because happiness involves rational activity. This is a really important passage. He says happiness is that for the sake of which everything else is done. That for the sake of which everything else is done. What is he claiming? That everything we do in our life, conscious or unconscious, is really directed toward our own desire to be happy. And I think the best, he says happiness is the end of all our actions. Now, I think the best example I can give to really illustrate what he's saying here is to look at a pro athlete. right? Let's say an NFL football player. They play 16 games a season, and then three more games if they're lucky in the postseason, right? It's only a part of the year, but the entire year they spend preparing and getting ready, trying to win one game, the Super Bowl. Everything they do for 364 days is all geared toward that one day, Super Bowl Sunday, to win the game. So in the middle of the off season, they're waking up, I don't know, imagine at 5 in the morning, and they're going out for a 5-mile run, and you're sitting there, oh my God, that looks awful. I want to be at home sleeping right now. And they're lifting weights, and they're stretching, and they're eating right, and they're doing all these things. They haven't even stepped on a football field, let alone played a game yet, right? And you realize that every action they take, let me tell you, when a football player is sitting there in the middle of the off season training, when they're training, they already have their goal in mind. They have that Super Bowl, and they're working back toward this day. They're saying, if I want to get here, this is what I have to do on this day here to get to it. And if I don't take all these intermediary steps, I'm not going to get to it. Right? So you can see how every action they're taking, from waking up in the morning to eating the right foods to getting the right kinds of exercise, is preparing themselves all for that single end, which is winning the Super Bowl. Aristotle says that human happiness is the complete or the simply complete end of human life, which is to say, it is the final end. Every day we have a series of ends or goals. We want to get up, we want to make breakfast, we want to eat it, we want to go to work, we want to drop our kid off at school, all these ends of our actions. But those are all subordinate ends to the larger goal, and we've seen that really illustrated in that hierarchical chart, and that's one of the reasons I show that, to really illustrate the way in which our immediate ends are really means to our bigger end, which is happiness. Happiness turns out to be a certain life or work done virtuously. It's a fully rational life. It's a life of activity of soul and action accompanied by reason, and it's the work of a serious human being. Clearly, happiness is an achievement, like winning the Super Bowl. I think that's why it's a relevant example. It's done through active engagement, and it doesn't just come to you. More specifically, in Book 1, Chapter 7, on page 13, he says, happiness is activity of soul in accord with virtue, and if there are several virtues, then the best and most complete one, but in addition, in a complete life. And we'll come back to that. He says, now since happiness is a certain activity of soul in accord with complete virtue, what concerns virtue would have to be examined, for perhaps in this way we might better contemplate happiness as well. So if we're going to understand happiness, we need to know what virtue is, because happiness is simply living virtuously. So then the concern becomes, what is virtue? So happiness is connected with the virtue distinctive of a human being. Now, what does he mean by distinctive? He means animals have various virtues of body and soul, and human beings have virtues that are distinctive to them that animals do not have. So our happiness is going to be connected with those virtues. So here we get the central definition of happiness for Aristotle. Unfortunately, it's incomplete, but it provides a pathway and a guide for our understanding, or a kind of map. He says this: if this is so, then the human good becomes an activity of soul in accord with virtue. Activity of soul in accord with virtue is just another way for saying virtuous activity. Or more directly, it's another way of saying living virtuously or living excellently. And he says, however, if there are several virtues, then in accord, living or acting in accord with the best and most complete one. Well, notice, for example, in that outline, toward the middle of this text, he gives us a whole list of virtues. He says, but happiness if there are several virtues, and the answer is yes, there are several, the conditional, there are several, then happiness is in accord or consistent with the best and most complete one. So our mission is to determine what is that complete one. But we're not done. In addition, he says this, but in addition, in a complete life. So there are two central criteria or conditions for happiness that we're going to see. Number one is virtuous activity, but not just virtuous living, virtuous in conformity with the best virtue of a human being. The question is, what is that virtue? Because he clearly hasn't told us. We don't even know what types of virtues there are at that stage. And then the second component is in a complete life. Now, what is a complete life? Okay, so here we have the two central components of Aristotle's definition of happiness. Number one, activity of soul in accord with reason and virtue, a rational and virtuous life, one that it's going to turn out of moral and intellectual virtue. And then a complete life. It turns out to have to do with a matter of duration. In the later chapters that I see listed here, 10, 11, and 13, he talks about how long does someone have to live in order for them to be considered happy. If they're virtuous for a day, does that make them happy? If they're virtuous throughout their whole youth and then they die, can they be considered happy there? So he goes through, does one have to live on in the afterlife in the form of their children? Do your children have to be happy in order for you to be happy? And his answer is, not entirely surprising, that one has to be virtuous for the duration of one's entire life, and one's life has to be reasonably long. You can't die young and be virtuous, because virtue, think about what virtue is. It's a process of maturity, right? And we're talking about fulfilling our nature, means reaching a kind of peak of performance, and that can only happen with living a certain period of time and going through various stages of life. So duration. So one has to live a full life. So I think it's simple. The football analogy is, do you deserve to be in the Hall of Fame as a football player? That's the happiness, the Valhalla of football. If you have one Pro Bowl season, you do not go to the Hall of Fame, however spectacular that season was. The whole concept of the Hall of Fame is not one spectacular season, but an entire career in which one is consistent with a high level, an exceptional level of achievement. So that's one aspect. You can see why that's complete. A complete life is one that's lived for a long time. The other thing that has to do with complete is not a matter of time, but a matter of what you have. What you have. So if we look here, the second part of the complete life is a matter of what you have around you, right? So it's complete not in the sense of time, a full life. It's complete in the sense of having all the necessary conditions and components. So notice this issue of complete life is not happiness itself, rather it is a precondition for it. He says, nonetheless, it is manifestly requires external goods in addition, right? So we talked about goods of the body, goods of the soul, and external goods. This is the equipment you need to get by. It requires external goods in addition. Just as we said, he says this, for it is impossible, or at least not easy, for someone without equipment to do what is noble, right? Without equipment, right? Can you be happy with little material well-being? His answer is, it's possible, he indicates, but it's not, it's much harder, right? It's going to turn out that many of the moral virtues that he discusses actually involve a sufficient amount of wealth. One of the really important moral virtues is liberality. And for him, liberality is the virtue of a free human being. But what does liberality really mean? A certain type of generosity with one's wealth, a willingness to give to other people to help them out, and to let go of one's wealth and use it for the well-being of other people. And of course, You can't help out. You can't do what's noble unless you have the wealth to give in the first place. Many things are done through instruments, through tools, through means, as it were, through friends, wealth, and political power. So notice, instruments are never the highest things. They are only means to ends. And here, notice, he invokes friendship as an instrument to get what you need. It is not an end in itself. And of course, we're going to find out that without friends, who are we going to perform virtuous deeds on if most virtues consist of moral virtues, which is, say, doing things in relationship to other people? You would need friends to do them toward, and they would be the exact object. So friends, wealth, and power are tools to achieve noble action, virtuous action. Those who are bereft of some of these, notice he doesn't say all, for example, good birth, good children, or beauty, disfigure their blessedness. So, does he agree with everything he's saying here? I actually don't think he does, but he's giving a kind of stereotypical thing, a stereotype of what people would expect to have in order to be happy. High birth, attractiveness, good kids, all these things are going to contribute. But he's actually going to say they are not happiness itself. They just provide the context. Someone of poor birth or solitary, childless cannot really be happy, characterized as happy. And he is perhaps still less happy if he should have altogether bad children, or friends, or though he did not have good ones, they are dead. Or though he had good ones, but they are dead. Just as we said then, happiness seems to require some external prosperity. That's equipment. Those are external goods. In addition, this is why some make good fortune equivalent to happiness and others virtue. So notice that all these people who have all these things have good fortune, right? They don't necessarily have virtue. You can have all these things and be utterly lacking in virtue, although likely the two would probably be associated. If you've got good friends and you've got political power, you clearly have certain excellences. But what he's ultimately concerned with is virtue, and it really calls into the question, it's really an individual matter how much of these things you need in order to be happy. I think it's going to turn out that what really matters for our own happiness is not going to be these material things. These are going to be kind of icing on the cake, but not really central. They're going to be tangential in some ways to our happiness, depending on who we are and the degree of material foundation we need. Okay, so now we reach our main challenge. At the end of book 1, in chapter 13, he says, now, since happiness is activity of soul in accord with complete virtue, what concerns virtue would have to be examined. He hasn't told us. He hasn't told us. Right? If happiness is virtuous activity, we need to know more about the virtues of a human being. And of course, these are by definition, he says in chapter 13, they're virtues of the soul. And the question is, we're looking for the best and most complete one. Well, what virtues do we have to choose from? The beginning of book 2, he makes that very clear. He says, virtue, then, is twofold, intellectual and moral. Both the coming into being and increase of intellectual virtue result mostly from teaching. Hence, it requires experience and time. Okay, so there's two sets of virtue, intellectual and moral. And he's got to also explain how they come into existence. What is the cause of them? And the simple answer is education, but really two different types of education. Intellectual virtue is the result of teaching. He says, whereas moral virtue is the result of habit. And it is, and so it is that moral virtue got its name, ethike, which is, we talked about ethos, the root of this word means habit or custom, by a slight alteration of the term habit, ethos. It is also clear as a result that none of the moral virtues are present in us by nature, since nothing that exists by nature is habituated to be other than it is. So here's an interesting use of the word nature here. So we do not have moral virtue in us by nature, right? What is he implying there? He's talking about our first nature. He's talking about our biological nature. Biologically, we don't have built into us moral virtue. It's something we need to be trained into by society, right? But what really matters for Aristotle is not our first nature, but our second nature, what we become as a result of our education. So let's finish with this thought and one other, which is, what did he mean by teaching versus habit or habituation? Teaching seems to mean kind of book learning, university learning, lecture, discussion, formal classroom education. Whereas habituation does not seem to involve speech. How does one deal with a child when they do the wrong thing? You habituate them to do the right thing. You create a system of rewards and punishments connected with basic statements about what to do and what not to do. So habituation is very much like justice. It involves the use of actions and not merely words. It involves deeds. Okay. And lastly, our mystery novel here about virtue. Which virtues matter? Which ones are superior? Intellectual virtues or moral virtues? I leave this to you. And then which one is the best and most complete? Because there's an array of moral virtues and there's an array of intellectual virtues. And even if we discovered that one were superior to the other, we would then have to pick a specific virtue among them to decide which one is the best and most complete and will provide us human happiness. However, and I'll leave you with this, the mystery to the question of which virtue is the best and most complete, the virtue whose exercise makes us fully human and therefore allows us to achieve happiness, is answered in Book 10. He waits from Book 1. He says he's going to talk about it later. It's not until Book 10 that he tells us what that best and most complete virtue is. And I leave it to you to discover what that virtue is. Thank you.